All right, welcome Drumright World History and United States History students here today in room 102. We're going to talk about two or three things. One of them, both of them tie into both classes, whether you're in U.S. history or world history, and even some government students may find this interesting. We're going to talk about the Vietnam War years, and we're also going to discuss counterculture and that type of stuff because it all plays a big role in the effects of world history, American history, and stuff like that, even things that are still going on a little bit today. Now, just a quick background from what you don't have on your handouts that are currently online for you to do and stuff like that is, remember there are four presidents, actually five, who dealt with the Vietnam War. President Truman, President Eisenhower, who sent aid, but the big one, the first big one was President Kennedy, who sent mostly military aid and support to the, at that time, what we didn't realize at the time, but we know now, was a corrupt South Vietnamese government. And then he eventually removed that ability when he found out that the current government was persecuting the Buddhists, and when he saw Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in the streets of Saigon, that's when he made the announcement, we're not going to support Vietnam anymore. The problem was about 2 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated, and of course Lyndon Johnson took over and off we went, okay, with that. But a lot of that stuff's on your study sheet just so you'll have an idea. Johnson would run the war would basically run his presidency, and then of course Richard Nixon would take over and he would basically to some degree get us out of Vietnam, but it was a long drawn out process. But some of the things that aren't on your handout that we want to go over in class very quickly are the conditions of the war and things that made it such a very unpopular contest in United States history. Remember when the war started and the Americans got involved in it, we thought we were doing the right thing, fighting to stop the spread of communism, okay? We had been somewhat successful during the Korean conflict, and now we were doing the same thing in Vietnam, but it was an area that we weren't prepared for. And when I say not prepared for, the American soldiers, no matter how well you were trained or prepared, the average combat soldier had no idea really what he was getting into to some degree. Now, sources on this are obviously if you have a father, uncle that served in Vietnam. In most cases, most of you, it's probably going to be grandfathers or great uncles or someone like that. Feel free to ask them any questions, okay? If they'll respond to you, you'll learn a lot about it, a lot more than you're probably going to learn from me. Now, first of all, what were difficulties did U.S. troops encounter in Vietnam? Well, number one, the type of warfare. The Viet Cong, which was our enemy, they used guerrilla warfare, ambush, and what we call hit and run. This is very difficult to fight against, okay? It's really the same tactic to some degree we used against the British in the Revolutionary War, okay? Fighting in brutal jungle conditions. The jungles of Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam, are pretty brutal. They had what was called elephant grass, which was razor sharp like razor blades, and things like that. So it was very difficult to even see the enemy. And in most cases, the enemy fired upon the Americans, and that's how you found them, okay? The lack of a traditional front. In most wars that American soldiers have fought in to some degree, there's a front. Like in World War II, we knew exactly in Europe on to Berlin, in the Pacific on to Tokyo. In South Vietnam, in the jungles and the highlands and all these places, there's no really front. You know, they're all around you, okay? And that type of stuff. The Viet Cong used its numerous tunnel systems, okay, which a lot of them today you can actually tour and go down in, aka last summer when the soccer team group or from some school got caught in a cave-in, got caught in there. The tunnel systems were there. Tunnel systems were sophisticated. They put everything in them including troops and ammunition. They also had field hospitals and all kinds of things. The tunnels were everywhere. That's also how they escaped the massive bombing campaigns that were launched against them. They just get underground in their tunnels. The Viet Cong's use of booby traps, okay? A booby trap can be numerous things, okay? It's whether you can wire hand grenades into the jungle, a tripwire to set them off. They had the punji stick pits, that's razor sharp bamboo blades that stick up so when you step in it goes right through your boot and all that type of stuff. Anything they could use to kill, harm, or maim American soldiers, the booby traps are very important. And then, of course, the biggest problem the U.S. troops struggled with was identifying the enemy. The old saying coming out of Vietnam, farmer by day, Viet Cong by night, is pretty much true. You never knew exactly who was the enemy, who was your friend, and so forth, okay? The three military strategies that the United States military used against the Viet Cong were very important. Some of these are on your handout. To expose Viet Cong tunnels and hideouts, U.S. planes dropped what? Gasoline-based bomb that set fire to the jungles? That's napalm, okay? Napalm was used there pretty extensively. They also, U.S. military used planes to spray what leaf-killing toxic chemical? Agent Orange, okay? At the time, they thought Agent Orange would be a great deal, but now they found out that numerous thousands upon thousands of Vietnam veterans have suffered from cancer and other types of diseases if you were exposed to Agent Orange, okay? Basic way of uprooting Vietnamese villagers and finding suspected ties to Viet Cong was simply what they called search and destroy missions, where you located where you thought they were in the villages, you went in on foot, and you cleared out these villages. And these could be some horrendous firefights and fighting that took place there, okay? Numerous special things about the Vietnam War. Of course, one of the early casualties of the war was President Johnson's Great Society, okay? They had to reduce $6 billion from it, and that program designed to help the American people, a lot of it went to the wayside, okay? What made the Vietnam War a little bit more special than any wars we fought prior to that? Well, number one, it's called the living room war because you watched it every night on the news on your television, okay? You watched it very closely. And I grew up during that time period, and I still remember coming home from football practice, basketball practice, from school, whatever, sitting down at the dinner table and going and watching the 6 or 6:30 news with my father, and there it is, the war is right there, okay? Literally right there, and you're seeing it. Something American people had not witnessed a great deal during Korea, World War I or World War II or any of the other previous wars. You're sitting there watching it, okay? It had a big impact on the American psyche. Matter of fact, to some point that it was the most influential item of turning the American public opinion against the war, and that of course was television, which was used extensively by the media, okay, and stuff like that. So it's pretty incredible. Okay, what system called up citizens for military service and was very, very unpopular during this time period? And that is the draft, okay? And anybody, like I said earlier, grandfathers, anybody that grew up during that time, all knew that when they turned 18, they had to go register for the draft. And so you spent your entire high school career during the 1960s and early 70s wondering if you were going to get drafted when you turned 18. I mean, it was just one of those things, okay? Now, what were some ways that people could avoid the draft if they wanted to? And believe it or not, there's more that did than you can imagine. They found doctors to give medical exemptions. Some people had legitimate reasons to keep them out. Some changed residence in order to stand before a more lenient draft board, okay? Others did the right thing. They joined the National Guard. They also joined the Coast Guard. Most enrolled in college, gaining what was called a college deferment. In other words, as long as you were in school taking a full load, you would not get drafted, okay? But by 1968, 69, they changed that, and the Defense Department attempted to reform the draft by instituting what was called a lottery system, okay? And I can still remember today, staying up one night watching it on television. They had this big tumbler full of 365 dates, and then they stopped it and they'd start pulling the dates. And my birthday, December 27th, was number 78, okay? So if it was right there at the top, chances are of you avoiding the draft was not going to happen, okay? Other factors that hurt troop morale in Vietnam, one of course was racism to some degree. And of course, how did most women, 10,000 of them serve in Vietnam, a lot of them served as nurses, okay? And things like that. Americans who opposed the war were labeled as doves or anti-war people, okay? In what ways did they show their opposition to the war? They held in public places anti-war rallies, okay? They would publicly burn their draft cards, which really didn't amount to anything. At least 10,000 Americans or more fled to Canada. Some even went as far to go to Sweden. And of course, they led the War March on Washington at one point in time, in which a lot of Vietnam veterans showed up and showed their support for ending the war during that, okay, with that. All right, the event in Vietnam that probably was the big turning point was the Tet Offensive of 1968. Even though the United States military, both Army, Marines, Air Force, you name it, won every battle of the Tet Offensive, the news media turned public opinion against the war, and a lot of people thought we were done, that we needed to get out of there. There's some stuff on that on your handout, okay? Eventually, the United States would withdraw from Vietnam after a long process, and a lot of disgruntled Americans at home and demonstrations and a lot of things. Again, most of that's on your handout if you choose to do it. Key dates that come to mind: 1973, first POWs were released. Okay, it was also the day the United States combat troops supposedly left Vietnam, so the fighting was basically over. Okay. 1974, President Gerald Ford asked Congress for $266 million in military aid to South Vietnam. Congress said no. Okay. Number of Americans killed in Vietnam, roughly 58,000. In November of 1973, Congress stated that the United States troops are not to remain longer than 90 days in a hostile area without governmental approval or declaration of war. That is the War Powers Act of 1973. That basically set the table to make sure we never had another Vietnam again, okay? Another positive note from the Vietnam War was the passing of the 26th Amendment that lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And it's very simple. Congress believed that if an 18-year-old was old enough to fight and die for their country, they should be old enough to vote for the politicians that are putting them in those positions. Very simple. Many Vietnam veterans suffered from what became known as post-traumatic stress syndrome, as well as being criticized, disrespected, and even faced hostility. You got to remember, when the Vietnam War veterans came home, they were not treated like the Korean veterans, the World War II veterans, the World War I veterans. Okay, they were labeled as baby killers and murderers and things like that, when they were just basically young men and women who went to serve their country and do the job they were asked to do. Okay, I have been told from various veteran administration places around the state of Oklahoma that probably the veterans that are suffering the most at the veteran centers are the Vietnam veterans. Okay, in 1982, to honor the men and women who served in Vietnam, the U.S. government unveiled what in Washington, D.C., that is the wall. Okay, I would encourage every young person in class to go to Washington someday and see the wall, or watch the newspapers periodically, the portable version of it, which looks just exactly like the real one. They bring it around to places. I've got former students that I've taken to see it, and it's an emotional, moving thing, and there's a lot of history they pack into it too, if you're really interested in the real stories of the Vietnam War. Okay, there's no questions, we'll conclude that. Now, for the American history students, we need to look at a couple of other extra things real quickly here. One of the things you're going to be asked to deal with is the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, okay? The main opponent of it was a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly. She felt the ERA would hurt women in the following ways. Number one, it would allow women to be drafted into the military, okay? Two, it ended laws protecting homemakers. Three, ended whose responsibility for this family? The husband, okay? And would lead to same-sex marriage, okay? Now, when she opposed most of this in the 1970s, a lot of this stuff was starting to brew up, and we have it today, such as same-sex marriage and single-parent homes being run by a mother, the husband, father's gone, things like that, but there it is. Now, the other thing that coincided with the women's rights movement, the Vietnam War, the 60s and stuff, was the counterculture, which is on your handout. But I want to go over some things that are not on your handout. What were the goals of the counterculture movement, for those that don't know? One, they took part in the demonstrations against the Vietnam War. They created idyllic communities of peace, love, and harmony. Now, that's kind of debatable today. Many of them joined the free speech movement on campuses to protest injustices. And they opposed mainstream American society called the establishment, okay? Establishment is anything that they were opposed to, okay? And of course, as you know, people who belong to the counterculture call themselves the hippies, okay? What were the main characteristics of the hippie movement? Well, they listened to rock and roll music of all shape, form, and fashion. They wore outrageous clothing. They had a more casual approach to sex. This is also referred to as a sexual revolution. They used illegal drugs. Men had long hair, longer hair, not so much today, but in some cases. And many chose to live in communes. That's where you just went out and lived on nature, like a big endless camping trip. Most of them, after a little while, gave up and came home. Okay, they found out the importance of a hot shower. Many wanted a society based on peace and love, which there's nothing wrong with that. And the goal of most hippies was to find freedom and spiritual enlightenment. Okay, don't know a whole lot about that, but there it is. Many hippies called themselves the flower children because of the colorful clothing they wore. The height of the hippie movement was called the 1967 Summer of Love. Okay, I was a junior in high school in 1967. I don't know much about the Summer of Love, but it was there. Okay. The massive August 1969 outdoor concert that demonstrated rock and roll's popularity, Woodstock. If you're interested, you can find on DVD in most bookstores or online, you can find the concert, and I would recommend, if you want to really know more about it, to watch it, okay? The counterculture did have some negative things. There were 3 problems that came from it, which are not much different than what we deal with in our world today. Drug addiction, okay? Overdose, and violence, okay? All 3 attracted sinister characters, such as the legendary Charles Manson, who was known for him and his cult of killing the actress Sharon Tate, okay? The rift between the hippies and their parents were called the generation gap, which I think it just was heightened by the counterculture. I think there's a generation gap all the time and stuff like that. But when it was all said and done, it was really interesting to me. As the mystique of the 60s wore off, thousands of hippies lined up at government offices to collect welfare and food stamps, being dependent on the very society they once rejected. All right. Now, like I said, there's some movies out there, there's some books you can read and things like that. Going back to Vietnam, there's some movies there. If you can ever find the documentary that I used parts of in class, Letters from Vietnam, that's a pretty good one to watch, because it's basically the story of Vietnam being told by veterans who fought there. Movies, you can always find the 1968 John Wayne Green Beret, but that's just a John Wayne movie, okay? But you can also find films like Full Metal Jacket, which gives you a little bit of an idea. The movie Platoon, made by Oliver Stone, based on his personal experiences in Vietnam in 1967. Just remember one thing, it's an Oliver Stone movie, okay? And the one that I've used in class, a lot of former students thought was really good and interesting, was We Were Soldiers, based on the famous book, We Were Soldiers When We Were Young, okay, about Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and the first combat soldiers, United States soldiers, to ever fight against the Vietnam RVN. That's the regular Vietnam, not the Viet Cong. First battle in November 1965. There are some movies there you can watch. There's some other things out there too. The Robert De Niro movie, The Deer Hunter, kind of gives you an idea of how the war affected people at home as the ones that went to it. There's all kinds of cult films there about this stuff if you're interested and you want to find and watch it sometime in your life. Other than that, we're going to stop right now and conclude this. I hope you're doing your assignments. I hope you're getting things turned in. One quick note, papers you're sending in, be sure you put your names on them so we know how to grade them, who to put them with, okay? And keep doing your work. Things are going to speed up. Pretty soon we're going to be to May 12th. School will be out. Right now people are turning in work to me. You're raising your grades, and I'm perfectly happy with the way things are going, okay? And if you have any questions, email me or get a hold of me, or you can visit me up here on Mondays and Tuesdays at the school. I'll be in the library with Mrs. Brown and Mr. Bilyeu packing packets. All right, there's no questions. Good luck to you, and stay safe and stay healthy.